Imagine for a moment being chained, not only by the iron shackles that bound your wrists and ankles, but also by an even darker prison, one that no one dared to speak of out loud. For centuries, enslaved women endured not only the weight of the whip at the whipping post, the punishments at the pillory, the forced labor in the slave quarters, and the humiliations imposed by plantation masters and overseers. They also suffered a silent and cruel torment, sexual slavery, a captivity within captivity, where the female body was turned into merchandise for pleasure and domination. In the big house, far from everyone's eyes, the torment of the night took place. Women were summoned by the masters, torn from their families in the slave quarters and forced to submit to desires that were never theirs. There was no choice, no escape, no voice. The black woman's body became a stage of sexual violence, a battlefield marked by tears, pain, and silence. This side of slavery was hidden, silenced in the books, and barely remembered in collective memory. People speak of shackles, chains, slave ships, the violence of the whip, and the scars of branding irons, but little is said about the unbearable weight these women carried in their wombs, their hearts and their souls. Sexual slavery was perhaps the cruelest form of domination because it did not end with the workday. It was a repeated violence night after night that spanned generations and left children of abuse as a living reminder of the pain. And this is what this video will talk about. A story of violence, but also of resistance, of memory, and of scars that still echo in the present. As you follow each chapter, you will discover how the body of the enslaved woman was turned into a territory of power, how sexual violence became a weapon of control, and how, even in the midst of terror, acts of silent courage were born. Prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is suffocated truth, hidden pain, memory that must be told. And when we dive into the first chapter, you will understand how there was an invisible captivity within slavery itself, a prison where even silence screamed. When we think of slavery, the most common image that comes to mind is forced labor in the sugar mills, sweat dripping under the scorching sun, shackles tightening around ankles, and cruel punishments at the whipping post. We see the overcrowded slave quarters, the pillory where bodies were tied and lashed, the sound of the whip cutting through the air. These elements, without a doubt, form the most well-known picture of slavery in Brazil. But there was another side, hidden, silent, and even more cruel, the invisible captivity. A prison not made of iron chains, but of absolute domination over the female body, turning women into sexual slaves. This captivity within captivity did not leave visible marks on the back, like the lashings. It tore from within, in the silence of the night, far from eyes that could witness it. While the slave quarters were a place of precarious rest after long days, the big house became the setting of the torment of the night. Plantation masters, overseers, and even the master's sons exercised total power, fueled by the belief that the enslaved woman was not seen as human, but as merchandise, a body available, property to be used at any time. To understand the brutality of this system, one must remember that slavery was upheld not only by iron chains, shackles, and slave ships, but also by the ideology of the absolute master. The plantation master believed he owned not only the labor of enslaved men and women, but also their lives, their intimacy, their dignity. The black woman's body was reduced to an instrument, used both to generate profit in the fields and to satisfy the darkest desires of its owners. Historical accounts indicate that this practice was known but rarely recorded explicitly. The silence of the time helped perpetuate forgetfulness. And yet, it was an open secret. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. The slave quarters witnessed muffled cries, while the big house hid crimes behind walls, lit by candlelight. This invisible captivity was even more perverse because there was no possible escape. If iron chains could be broken in a daring attempt to flee, sexual domination was imposed continuously and inevitably. Young women were the most targeted, often right after disembarking from a slave ship, still marked by the cruel Atlantic crossing. They were chosen by the masters not only for the fields, but also for the corridors of the big house. Beauty and youth were appraised like merchandise at auctions, where buyers knew that the value of an enslaved woman lay not only in her labor, but also in her sexual exploitation. It was a market of bodies disguised as a labor market. Within this context, the overseer played a central role. He not only watched over the slave quarters, enforced punishments at the pillory and at the whipping post, but also often participated in the abuses. With the master's consent, he turned the whip into an instrument of intimidation, ensuring that the woman would never dare resist the call of the big house. Each night, the torment began again. Fear did not end when the sun went down. On the contrary, it was at night that terror took shape. The most perverse aspect of this invisible captivity was the absence of a voice. If a woman tried to complain, she would be punished at the pillory, whipped in front of everyone, or even branded with hot iron. Silence was the only way out, and pain turned into an inheritance passed down through generations. Many of these women became pregnant, bringing into the world children of abuse who carried in their very bodies the living proof of violence. These children, instead of representing love or hope, were constant reminders of pain. Many were sold as children, others grew up in the slave quarters, under the stigma of being children of masters who would never acknowledge them. This invisible captivity profoundly shaped life on colonial plantations. The slave quarters became places of shared pain, of contained tears, but also of silent resistance. Even under shackles and chains, these women found strength in bonds of solidarity. They cared for one another, protected the youngest, tried to prepare the girls for the inevitable call of the big house. This resistance, though silent, was a way of fighting against a system that seemed invincible. The impact of this captivity did not end with the abolition of slavery. Its marks crossed centuries and echo to this day in the form of structural racism, inequality, and violence against black women. The silence that official history maintained about sexual slavery reveals not only an attempt to erase pain, but also to protect the image of an elite that thrived on such absolute power. And when we think of slavery only as chains, pillories, and whipping posts, we forget to look at this invisible prison. But it existed, it was real, and it left scars that time did not erase. And it is precisely from this cruel reality that we move into the next chapter, where we will understand how this so-called right of the master over the female body turned into an obligation that no enslaved woman could refuse, giving shape to the most feared torment of the night. In the cruel universe of slavery, there was an obligation imposed on enslaved women that none could refuse. It was not forced labor in the sugarcane fields, nor the endless hours at the loom or in the kitchen of the big house. It was something even more intimate, more painful, and more silent. The obligation to submit to the master, the overseer, or any other man who considered himself owner of her body. The torment of the night was not a choice, it was a sentence. The black woman had no voice, no protection, no right to say no. The so-called right of the master over the enslaved woman was rooted in the perverse logic that she was property, part of the inventory, an object listed among shackles, iron chains, work tools, and animals. If the plantation master could decide whether an enslaved person would go to the pillory, to the whipping post, or be sold at a slave market auction, he could also decide over the woman's body. This absolute power made sexual violence not a crime, but a practice legitimized by the silence of society. The nights on colonial farms held dark secrets, while exhausted men and women in the slave quarters tried to rest after long days of labor. In the big house, candelabras were lit, illuminating corridors of abuse. Many women were summoned by the overseer, dragged against their will, forced to cross the gates, separating the world of the slave quarters from the territory of the big house. Each step was marked by fear, for they knew the fate that awaited them. The torment of the night was not only physical, but also psychological. The body became an object of pleasure and power. The silence imposed by threats was as brutal as the whip. Resisting could mean being punished in front of everyone, tied to a post, whipped until the skin tore, or branded with a hot iron. The cruel choice was between rape and torture. In both cases, the woman lost. The youngest were the most targeted. Teenagers, still bearing the scars of the slave ships crossing, torn from their families in Africa, were now violated in Brazilian lands. The overseer was often the intermediary of this torment. He fetched the woman from the slave quarters, delivered her to the plantation master, and then returned to oversee her work the next day, as if nothing had happened. The female body was a bargaining chip, a punishment, a forced pleasure. The most terrible thing was that this practice was known yet silenced. The other enslaved people in the quarters knew what happened when a woman was called at night, but they could not intervene. Men, partners, and husbands suffered helplessly, knowing that reacting could mean being punished at the whipping post until death. Sexual slavery was a collective wound. It humiliated the woman, destroyed families, weakened resistance, and reinforced the master's absolute power. The sons of the big house also participated in this cycle of violence. Raised to believe everything belonged to them, they saw enslaved women as easy targets to satisfy their desires. For them, there were no limits. Often, the violence was accompanied by laughter, as if the woman's suffering was an insignificant detail. This normalization of sexual violence shows that slavery was not only an economic system, but also a cultural system of domination and dehumanization. The obligation no enslaved woman could refuse persisted because it was upheld by a cruel tripod: fear of physical punishment, the absence of rights, and social silence. Colonial society turned a blind eye to these abuses, because admitting their existence would mean acknowledging that the foundation of the economy and morality of the time was tainted by violence. It was easier to hide, it was easier to silence, yet the torment of the night left deep scars. Many women became pregnant by their masters or overseers, giving birth to children of abuse. These children carried in their very bodies the proof of violence, but were rarely acknowledged. Often they grew up in the slave quarters, treated as enslaved, despite being direct descendants of the men who ruled the big house. It was the cruelest contradiction of slavery: masters who raped women and then enslaved their own children. This cycle fueled not only individual pain, but the collective pain of a people torn from their homeland and trapped in visible and invisible chains. The female body became a battlefield where a silent war was waged between power and submission, between humiliation and resistance. Even when they could not fight with weapons or escape, many women found ways to resist, denying affection to the aggressor, protecting the younger ones, caring for one another. This chapter of slavery's history shows that captivity was not only physical. The torment of the night revealed that sexual slavery was perhaps the most brutal form of domination. The female body, already exhausted from forced labor, was still condemned to endure constant abuse, without rest, without a voice, without choice. And when we think of this obligation that no enslaved woman could refuse, we must understand that its consequences did not end there. From this cycle of abuse came children of rape, who carried in their existence the living memory of a violence that society tried to erase. And it is about them, these children marked from the womb by the pain of slavery, that we will speak in the next chapter. From the dark corridors of the big house and the nights marked by torment, children were born already carrying the mark of violence in their bodies. These were the so-called children of abuse, the fruits of repeated rapes and an obligation no enslaved woman could refuse. These children came into the world bearing in their blood the cruelest contradiction of slavery. They were descendants of plantation masters, but grew up in the slave quarters, marked by the same enslaved condition. For the masters, these children were proof of power, but rarely acknowledged. Many were treated as mere labor units, listed alongside shackles, iron chains, animals and tools in the farm inventories. Some were even given dehumanizing names to erase any trace of connection to the big house. The child was not seen as a blood heir, but as property, as merchandise ready to be sold when convenient. Enslaved women suffered doubly. First, they carried in their wombs the living memory of sexual violence. Then they were forced to surrender their children to the same system that enslaved them. Often these babies were sold while still young, separated from their mothers and sent to other farms, perpetuating the pain of separation. The slave market did not distinguish blood ties or affection. The child of abuse could be auctioned alongside any other enslaved person, valued for physical strength or appearance. In the slave quarters, these children faced a cruel fate. They grew up surrounded by suspicious glances from both masters and other enslaved people. For the masters, they were unwanted reminders of illicit relations. For the companions of the violated women, they were living marks of collective humiliation. Often, these boys and girls faced exclusion, carrying an identity shaped by the pain of their origin. The big house, meanwhile, pretended not to see. Illegitimate children born of abuse were hidden, ignored, or treated as invisible, while the legitimate children of the masters received education, fine clothes, and inheritance rights. The children of the slave quarters were born condemned to forced labor, the whipping post, the pillory, and the weight of iron chains. This disparity exposed the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to be Christian but accepted fathers enslaving their own children. The presence of these children also served as a mechanism of power. The master knew that each child of abuse was a constant reminder to the violated woman. It was a form of psychological control, turning motherhood into yet another prison. It was not enough to enslave the woman's body. The fruit born of it was also enslaved. The slave quarters, already a place of pain and suffering, became filled with children who represented the continuation of violence. Yet, these children were not only symbols of pain. Many also became symbols of resistance. Mothers and grandmothers cared for them with love, even amidst adversity, trying to reclaim some sense of dignity. Some women, aware that their children were destined for captivity, passed down stories of Africa, memories of freedom, songs and traditions, as a way to keep alive a spark of identity that the system tried to extinguish. It was a silent act of resistance, sowing hope in the hearts of the children of abuse. However, the pain could not always be transformed into strength. Many of these boys and girls grew up carrying the rejection of their own paternal blood. The plantation master who fathered them would never acknowledge them as family. At most, some received lighter domestic tasks, working in the big house as servants, but never occupying the place of legitimate children. They lived on an invisible line, rejected by both worlds, not fully belonging to the slave quarters nor accepted in the big house. The most common fate, however, was that of the slave quarters. There, from a very young age, these children of abuse learned to face the whip, the post, the iron chains, and the punishments imposed by overseers. They grew up under the shadow of the pillory, knowing their condition was no different from that of any other enslaved person. Many were sold as teenagers, sent on slave ships to other regions, torn once again from their families. This cycle of pain was not limited to the past. It left deep scars that spanned generations. The presence of the children of abuse exposes the cruelest face of structural racism, the complete dehumanization of the black body, treated as property even in the act of creating life. And even as these children grew, the stigma of their origin continued to follow them. The children of abuse are the living reminder that sexual slavery was not a side detail, but a structural part of the slave system. They prove that sexual violence did not end with the night. It extended into entire lives, into generations condemned to carry in their bodies and souls the memory of pain. And if these children were born from abuse, they were also born from the logic of absolute power. Rape was not just an individual desire, it was a weapon of control, punishment, and intimidation. And it is precisely this aspect, how sexual violence became a strategy of domination and submission, that we will reflect on in the next chapter. Slavery was not only a system of forced labor, marked by shackles, iron chains, whipping posts, and pillories. It was also a system of absolute power, in which every detail of the lives of the enslaved was under the control of the plantation master and his overseers. And in this universe of oppression, sexual violence was more than desire or pleasure. It was a weapon of control, a calculated instrument to impose fear, submission, and collective humiliation. The rape of enslaved women served as punishment. If a group in the slave quarters was accused of insubordination, if someone attempted to escape, or if a family showed signs of resistance, the punishment did not come only through the whip or the pillory. Many times, the master would choose the wife of one of the rebels and violate her in front of everyone, turning the torment of the night into a spectacle of power. This practice was not only against the woman's body, but also against the hearts of the men who could do nothing. With each assault, the message was clear. No one had power except the master. The humiliation was twofold. For the woman, it meant the loss of dignity and the deep trauma of sexual violence. For the man, companion or husband, it meant impotence in the face of his wife's or partner's pain. The overseer often participated actively in this cycle, not only enforcing punishments at the pillory, but also collaborating in the sexual abuse as a way to show that he too was above the enslaved. Thus, sexual violence functioned as an extension of the whip, a wound that struck both body and soul. The torment of the night was used as a constant threat. A single word of insubordination, a look of disobedience, or even a rumor of revolt could be enough for a woman to be chosen as the victim. Sexual slavery was proof that the master's power had no limits. Neither intimacy nor family ties were respected. The woman's body became a conquered territory, used to break any attempt at resistance. There are records that in some plantations, rape was used as a ritual of public punishment. The woman was exposed before the enslaved community, forced to endure the violence while the others watched helplessly. The purpose was not only to satisfy the aggressor, but also to engrave into the collective imagination that no one was free from the absolute power of the big house. It was a spectacle of terror, calculated to paralyze any idea of rebellion. This type of violence also produced devastating psychological effects. Many women, after successive rapes, lost the will to fight. The slave quarters, already a space of pain and suffering, became even darker when the victims returned, carrying not only the weight of fatigue, but also the weight of silence. This silence was fed by the fear of further punishment, by imposed shame, and by the impossibility of denouncing. For the masters, sexual violence was useful because it weakened bonds of solidarity. Humiliated husbands, traumatized women, children born of abuse. All of this served to divide, to prevent the enslaved community from uniting against its oppressors. Sexual violence, therefore, was part of a power strategy that complemented shackles, whips, and the pillory. Domination was not limited to the body exhausted by labor, but extended to the heart and the mind. In some cases, the women themselves were forced to choose between rape and another form of punishment. Refusing could mean being whipped to death, being sold at distant markets, or seeing their children punished at the pillory. It was an impossible choice, a violence that infiltrated every dimension of life. The so-called right of the master knew no boundaries, and the overseer was always ready to ensure that no one escaped this logic. This use of violence as a weapon of control shows that slavery was sustained by more than physical force. It was sustained by fear, humiliation, and trauma. It was a system that turned even intimacy into a territory of domination. And although the pillory and the whip have remained as visible symbols of slavery, repeated and calculated rape was perhaps the most devastating weapon because it destroyed not only the body, but also hope. Yet even in the midst of so much terror, there was resistance. Many women found ways to deny affection, to protect their daughters, to guard secrets that escaped the master's control. The violence was real, but humanity persisted, and it is precisely at this point that we enter the next chapter. The torment of the night, the most feared moment when the big house called and the silence of the slave quarters was filled with fear. If the day was already marked by the weight of forced labor, by shackles tightening around ankles, and by the constant sound of the whip against skin, the night brought an even greater fear. For many enslaved people, sunset meant a brief relief from the sweat of the fields, a rest in the slave quarters, even if under inhuman conditions. But for women, the fall of night announced the cruelest torment, the torment of the night. It was at this moment that the silence in the slave quarters grew heavy, for everyone knew that at any moment the overseer could open the door and call a woman by name. The path to the big house, lit by torches and candelabras, was a journey of humiliation. Each step was accompanied by silent glances, a mix of compassion, pain, and powerlessness. Husbands could do nothing, children wept quietly, and older mothers prayed softly that their daughters would not be next. The torment of the night was not just an act of sexual violence, it was an established routine. Plantation masters saw this practice as part of their rights. The big house, a symbol of wealth and power, hid behind its walls crimes that society preferred to ignore. While the slave quarters were filled with exhausted bodies trying to sleep, the corridors of the big house echoed with the footsteps of women dragged against their will. The youngest were the most feared to be called. Often still teenagers, they were forced to cross the gate, separating the slave quarters from the big house. The fear was not only of physical abuse, but also of the shame of returning to the slave quarters with the mark of humiliation in their eyes. The torment of the night left invisible scars as deep as the whip marks on a whipping post. Not infrequently, overseers participated in this ritual of terror. They went to the slave quarters, chose the woman who had to go up, and led her to the master. In some cases, they too exploited their position of power to satisfy their own desires. The enslaved woman's body became currency, an object, a field of domination. The torment of the night was also a strategy of collective fear. By calling a woman in front of everyone, the plantation master showed that there was no private space, that not even intimacy was safe. The silence of the slave quarters was, in reality, a stifled scream. Every family knew they could be the next to lose their nightly peace. The terror was constant, and rest was never complete. Some women, in desperation, tried to resist, but resistance came at a cost. Many were punished with lashes at the pillory, exposed before all as an example. Others were tied to a post, punished until exhaustion. Refusal was never tolerated, as it meant defying the master's authority. For many, all that remained was silence, stifled tears, and forced resignation. Even so, within this scene of pain, small acts of resistance emerged. Some older mothers tried to hide their daughters, offering themselves in their place. Others used herbs to prevent unwanted pregnancies, a desperate attempt to stop the birth of more children of abuse. These small acts, though unable to halt the torment of the night, were demonstrations of courage in the face of the impossible. The contrast between day and night was cruel. If during the day the whip and shackles controlled bodies in labor, at night the sexual torment controlled souls. The slave quarters and the big house represented two opposing worlds, yet connected by the same logic of domination, one a space of collective exploitation, the other of intimate exploitation. This endless cycle left scars that spanned generations. The torment of the night not only violated women, but also destroyed families, fueled traumas, and perpetuated fear as a tool of power. Each dawn was a new silent battle, and each return to the slave quarters was a reminder that their bodies did not belong to them. This commodification of the female body, treated as part of the farm's wealth, reveals the next dark chapter of this story: the flesh market. There, the youth and beauty of enslaved women were evaluated as commodities, and many were sold not only for labor, but for sexual exploitation. The torment of the night revealed the intimate and silent violence that took place within the big house. But the sexual exploitation of enslaved women was not limited to that space. There was also an open, visible practice recorded in the auctions themselves: the flesh market. In it, the youth, beauty, and even fragility of women were assessed as attributes that increased their sale price, turning their bodies into commodities destined not only for labor, but also for desire and abuse. At auctions held in public squares or trading spaces, women were displayed before buyers as if they were objects in a showcase. The youngest, especially teenagers newly arrived on slave ships, were subjected to invasive stares. Plantation masters and overseers scrutinized their bodies, evaluating not only their physical strength for fieldwork, but also traits deemed attractive: skin, hair, teeth, curves. Everything was grounds for judgment and negotiation. This cruel market revealed a perverse logic. The value of an enslaved woman was not only in her ability to produce wealth in sugar, coffee, or cotton plantations, it was also in her condition as an object of pleasure. The big houses knew that by buying a young enslaved woman, they were acquiring not only a worker, but also a victim available for the torment of the night. Thus, sexual exploitation became institutionalized as part of the slavery system's economy. Many historical accounts note that these young women were touched, groped, and examined in front of everyone as if they were animals. Their mouths were opened to check their teeth, their arms and legs squeezed to assess strength, but their breasts and hips were also inspected, as these were considered signs of fertility and attractiveness. This public inspection was itself a form of violence, a preview of the cruel fate awaiting them. The price of a woman deemed beautiful or virgin could be much higher. This was because beyond labor, she represented profit in another dimension, direct sexual exploitation, or even the possibility of bearing children of abuse, who would also be enslaved and thus the master's property. The logic was brutal. The more valuable the female body was considered in this market, the more suffering was imposed upon it. There was also a symbolic aspect to this trade. Buying a young enslaved woman and displaying her as part of one's wealth was also a way to flaunt power. Masters took pride in owning not only land, mills, and slave ships, but also women whose youth was exploited in silence. Possession of the female body became a public display of social and economic status. The flesh market did not end with the initial purchase. Enslaved women were constantly resold, traded, and exchanged as if they were common goods. Many were sold after years of abuse, when they no longer held the same value of youth, and replaced with younger ones. This practice created an endless cycle of pain. Generation after generation of enslaved women faced the same fate. The horror of this market extended into the farms themselves. Within the slave quarters, women could be offered or traded among masters and overseers as payment for debts or favors. The woman's body was not hers, it belonged to the system, a cog in the machinery of slavery. This absolute commodification reduced lives to numbers and bodies to consumable objects. Many of these young women, after being sold, lived under constant surveillance. They were watched in the fields, punished at the whipping post, and at night, taken to the big house. The promise of forced labor also became a sentence of sexual violence. The flesh market, therefore, did not end at the auction. It was the beginning of a new prison, an extension of the journey on the slave ship, where the body had already been violated by traffickers before even reaching Brazil. The impact of this trade was devastating. For the women, it meant the total loss of autonomy, the impossibility of choosing any aspect of their lives. For enslaved communities, it was a constant reminder that even the wombs of women could be bought and sold. For the children born of these abuses, it was the perpetuation of a cycle that seemed never-ending. Yet, even in this scenario, there was silent resistance. Some women found ways to protect themselves, using strategies passed down from their African ancestors. They used herbs to prevent pregnancies, exchanged messages of care in the slave quarters, and sang songs that recalled lost freedom. These small acts were gestures of humanity in the midst of a market that sought to reduce them to mere commodities. The flesh market brutally reveals how slavery was not limited to forced labor. It invaded intimacy, commodified bodies, destroyed families, and perpetuated violence in every dimension of life. It was a trade in pain, sustained by shackles, whips, and silence. And if this cruel trade marked generations, it also left deep scars that persist through time. The consequences of this market of bodies still echo in today's society in the form of racism, inequality, and violence against black women. Yet, amidst so much horror, forms of resistance, courage, and solidarity emerged. And that is precisely what we will discuss in the next chapter. How even within captivity, enslaved women found ways to resist silently, preserving their humanity in the face of brutality. Amid the unbearable weight of shackles, the sound of the whip echoing on the whipping post, and the humiliations of the pillory, enslaved women found ways to resist. Not always with weapons or daring escapes, but with small, almost invisible gestures that kept their humanity alive. This silent resistance was often the only way to affirm that, despite captivity, their dignity could not be entirely erased. The slave quarters, a place of pain and suffering, also became a refuge of solidarity. There, in the silence of the night, women exchanged words of comfort, shared their stories, and passed down memories of Africa. They sang lullabies that spoke of freedom, prayed in ancestral languages, and strengthened one another to endure the torment of the night imposed by the big house. Each song, each whispered word, was an act of resistance against the silence the system sought to impose. Many mothers and grandmothers took on the mission of protecting the younger ones. They knew that plantation masters and overseers preferred teenage girls, seen as more valuable in the flesh market. Thus, older women tried to hide the girls, offering themselves in their place when the overseer called. This act of sacrifice was one of the most painful forms of resistance, submitting to violence to save a daughter or granddaughter. Other women used ancestral knowledge of herbs to try to prevent unwanted pregnancies. They knew that a child of abuse was another wound, a living reminder of the torment of the night. So they prepared potions and teas that circulated secretly in the slave quarters. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation as a silent weapon against the domination of the big house. Some, in desperation, induced abortions to prevent the violence from perpetuating in their wombs. These acts, though marked by pain, were also forms of resistance, refusing to give the master another enslaved child, another life condemned to shackles and the whipping post. This extreme choice showed the lengths to which women went in their fight to preserve themselves. But silent resistance was not only in practical actions, it was also in the preservation of memory. Many women told stories of their homeland, narrated African myths, spoke of kings and queens, gods and spirits that gave them strength. These stories kept the flame of identity alive, reminding them that before the slave ship, there was a life of dignity. It was a way of affirming that slavery could not steal everything. Songs were another powerful form of resistance. While working in the fields under the overseer's watchful eye, women sang. At first glance, they seemed like work songs, but they hid messages of hope and freedom. In the slave quarters, these songs cradled the children of abuse, turning pain into melody, suffering into collective memory. Each note sung was a way to resist erasure, a reminder that the soul was not in chains. The solidarity among enslaved women was an invisible weapon. They tended to each other's wounds, shared hidden food, and bore the weight of pain together. This silent sisterhood prevented sexual violence from completely destroying their humanity. If the big house sought to reduce women to commodities in the flesh market, the slave quarters reclaimed them as sisters in struggle. Even in the face of the torment of the night, some dared to resist directly. There are records of women who confronted overseers, refused to obey, or attempted to escape. Many paid with their lives, punished at the pillory, or hunted by slave catchers. But their acts remained in the collective memory as examples of courage. Each woman who rose against the system showed that slavery was not passively accepted, that there was a fight even in the shadows. Silent resistance was also evident in the care for their children. Mothers knew their children could be sold at any moment, separated from them forever. Yet, they filled those brief moments together with love. They passed down values, hope, and dignity, even when the future seemed lost. This love was, in itself, a form of resistance, because it kept alive what slavery sought to erase: humanity. This collection of small, often invisible gestures sustained the survival of generations. Slavery sought to reduce women to available bodies, inventory items, victims of rape and punishment. But silent resistance showed that, even without weapons, even under chains and whips, it was possible to fight. This struggle did not erase the pain, but it preserved memory, and it is this memory that still echoes today as both a scar and a legacy. And it is precisely at this point that we arrive at the next chapter. Because if silent resistance kept humanity alive, the marks of sexual violence and exploitation remain etched forever. Marks on the body, the soul, and history, which have crossed generations and reached us as a reminder of a captivity that must never be forgotten. Slavery left deep scars on the history of Brazil and the world, but perhaps none as painful as the invisible marks left by sexual slavery. While shackles, whipping posts, and pillories punished bodies visibly, sexual violence tore from within, engraving memories that spanned generations. These marks did not vanish with abolition. They persist today, echoing in the lives of millions of descendants of women who endured the torment of the night and the flesh market. The physical marks were only the surface of the pain. Many women suffered severe injuries from violent rapes. Others were left with lasting effects from forced pregnancies and traumatic births, often carried out in precarious conditions within the slave quarters. The female body, exploited by day in the fields and by night in the big house, bore visible scars, but also internal pains that could not be seen. and these pains were passed down because the violence was rarely a one-time event. It was repeated routine, turning the body into a constantly violated territory. But the deepest marks were psychological. The silence imposed by the whip, the post, and the overseer did not erase the trauma. Each torment of the night destroyed a piece of self-esteem, identity, and hope. Enslaved women lived between the fear of being called to the big house and the shame of carrying children of abuse in their wombs. Many had silent crying spells, hidden in the slave quarters, knowing that expressing pain could lead to further punishment. This psychological oppression shaped a legacy of suffering that crossed centuries. These marks were also social. The children of abuse, born of sexual violence, grew up in a society that rejected them. They were not recognized as legitimate, inherited nothing from the plantation masters, and were not fully accepted in the enslaved community, as they represented a living reminder of humiliation. This contradiction created entire generations of stigmatized children, condemned to live in a limbo between the slave quarters and the big house. Over time, these marks transformed into broader social structures. The structural racism that still shapes the lives of millions today has its roots in this period. The objectification of the black woman's body, seen as a commodity in the flesh market and an object in the torment of the night, left a legacy of hypersexualization and violence that persists to this day. Even now, many black women face stigmas, prejudices, and violence that are direct echoes of this enslaved past. Sexual slavery also left marks on how society views motherhood. The womb of the enslaved woman was turned into a tool for profit. Bearing children meant increasing the master's wealth, as those children would automatically be enslaved. This inhumane logic reduced motherhood to a cog in the machinery of the slave economy. The trauma of this reality was passed from mother to daughter, creating a painful memory where giving birth was always associated with the pain of loss and exploitation. These eternal marks also manifest in collective memory. Many black families carry fragmented memories of violence in their stories, tales that books tried to silence but survived in songs, prayers, and oral traditions. This memory, though painful, also became a form of resistance, reminding new generations that the suffering endured must not be forgotten, so it is never repeated. There are also the marks of inequality. Even after abolition, the descendants of these women received no reparations. Instead, they were left to fend for themselves, without land, education, or opportunities. Structural racism kept the invisible chains alive, turning formal freedom into a new form of captivity. To this day, the legacy of sexual slavery manifests in social exclusion, domestic violence, and the lack of recognition for historical pain. The cruelest realization is that these marks do not belong only to the past. They are present today in how society still dehumanizes black bodies, still associates black women with stereotypes of exploitation, and still ignores the scars left by slavery. Sexual violence, used as a weapon of control for centuries, continues to repeat itself in different contexts as a persistent shadow of a system that was never fully dismantled. And yet, these marks have also transformed into strength, because every scar carries a story of survival. The women who endured the torment of the night, faced the flesh market, raised children of abuse, and still passed down love, left a legacy of resistance. They showed that, even in the face of the deepest pain, it was possible to preserve dignity. The eternal marks of sexual slavery force us to look at history without masks. They remind us that slavery was not just chains, posts, and whips. It was also domination over the body, over intimacy, over the life generated in women's wombs. It was the transformation of human beings into commodities, property, and objects. And these scars remain open, awaiting recognition justice, and memory. And it is at this point that we move toward the conclusion of this narrative. Because it is not enough to merely know the marks of sexual slavery, we must reflect on how they still shape the present, and above all, remember that memory is the most powerful weapon against forgetting. In the conclusion, we will explore how this painful truth can become a tool for resistance and for building a more just future. Sexual slavery was a captivity within captivity, a torment that marked not only bodies, but also souls and entire generations. The whipping post, the pillory, the shackles, and the whips are already recognized symbols of slavery. But the torment of the night, the flesh market, and the children of abuse remain less remembered wounds, though equally profound. Ignoring this reality is erasing the pain of thousands of enslaved women whose dignity was stolen. These stories must be told because their marks are still among us. The sexual violence used as a weapon of control left visible legacies in structural racism, social inequality, and the way the black woman's body is still perceived. The silence of the slave quarters echoes today in statistics of violence against black women who remain the primary victims of abuse, exploitation, and exclusion. The chains have changed form, but they have not disappeared. Remembering these women is more than a historical exercise. It is an act of justice. It is recognizing that even subjected to terror, they resisted in silence, passing down memories, protecting their daughters, caring for the children of abuse, and preserving a spark of dignity that the plantation master could never extinguish. Every song sung in the slave quarters, every story of Africa whispered in the dark, every gesture of solidarity was a victory against forgetting. And that is why this memory must be kept alive, because speaking about the invisible captivity is also speaking about the present. It is understanding that the fight against sexual violence, racism, and dehumanization is not over. The resistance of enslaved women teaches us that, even in the face of the impossible, it is possible to resist. And it challenges us not to let silence erase the pain again. What we have seen here is not just a story of the past. It is a truth that still cries out today, a truth that demands recognition, respect, and action. Every time we remember the torment of the night, we give voice to the women who were forced to remain silent. Every time we speak of the children of abuse, we reclaim lives that were reduced to numbers. Every time we acknowledge the flesh market, we denounce a logic that still persists in other forms of exploitation. And this is where you, who have watched until the end, become part of this story. By sharing this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on the notification bell, you help keep alive the memory of those who could not tell their own story. You become part of the resistance against forgetting, because only by remembering can we resist. Only by resisting can we transform. And only by transforming can we ensure that silence never again becomes complicit in pain.